My, thank you. Thank you, Jenny and Dan and the choir. My, what a precious thought. I am redeemed. My, wonderful, wonderful thought. Let me share with you a little history and a little background here to today's message. You know, to the Jews, genealogy is a very important thing and really a very sacred thing. Genealogy. For example, in Matthew chapter 1, we see the genealogy of Jesus Christ listed there. Matthew gives us a running commentary on the family tree of Jesus Christ. You don't need to turn there. But if you look at that set of verses in Matthew 1, you will find that verses 2 through 6 talk about the generations from Abraham all the way down to David. And then if you look at verses 7 through 12, you'll find it picks up with David and goes all the way through the exile in Babylon. And then if you look further at verses 12 through 16, those record the period from the exile in Babylon to the birth of Jesus Christ. The birth of Jesus Christ. Now you might group those three categories several ways. One way is to think of them, the first group would be the judges, the second group would be the kings of Israel, and the third group would be just ordinary people, people like you and I, you and me. But here's what Matthew wrote in chapter 1, verses 17. He says this, important thing to say. He says, there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David. Think about this. From Abraham to David, that's the judges period. And then from David to the exile, there were 14 more. 14 from the exile to Babylon. And that's the period of the kings. And from there, the period of the kings, all the way through the birth of Jesus Christ, there are 14 more. Think about that. 14 and 14 and 14. Only God could do that. Who else? Who else could structure it like that? That's amazing, isn't it? And David, you see, begins the second phase of that line. And that's what I want to talk about today. Not about David, but about David's wife, Bathsheba. Bathsheba the mother. People kind of cringe when they think of the name Bathsheba or when they hear the name Bathsheba. But I'm here to tell you, I think Bathsheba gets a bad rap. Unjustified. I'm going to make that case today. I'm going to share with you why I think that's wrong. Following down through Jesus Christ would come from Judah, but it didn't say which family in Judah until the time of David. To understand Bathsheba, we need to look at the story of David and Bathsheba, and we'll do that in just a minute. But first, let me give you a little bit of background. You see, this was at the time of year when kings went off to war. It says that. It was springtime. And as my Old Testament professor in seminary used to say, kings love to go to war in springtime in Israel. Why did they do that? Why? Because it was not cold. The rains had stopped. The ground was firm. It was just, and they didn't have spring training. Okay? So they went to war. That's what kings did back in the time of Israel. You and I wouldn't think of that as a good thing to do, but they certainly did. What happened was King David had sent over some of his servants to the Ammonites who had lost their king. Their king had died. His name was Nahash, N-A-H-A-S-H. He had died. So David sends some servants over to go to his funeral. And the son of King Nahash didn't like that, a fellow by the name of Hanun. Didn't like that. He thought they had come to spy out his land and his territory and his army and everything around it, the defenses and so forth. And so he cut off their hair, half of their hair, and he cut off half of their clothing to embarrass them. And he sent them back to David, like, don't do that again. Well, David was much incensed over that. So David decided he was going to go to war with the Ammonites. And that's exactly what he did. Now, I'm going to share with you this wonderful set of verses that details the story of David and Bathsheba. But before I do that, I want to remind you, and I think you would probably share with me that what we know about Bathsheba is something like this. We know that she was probably out on the rooftop of her house, probably sunning herself, lounging around. David was on the rooftop of his palace, and he probably came out and saw her there, and she was attractive and seductive and all the things like that. And so she appealed to him, and we know what happened from there, and it was kind of an awkward situation. But let's share the story and just see if that's really what happened, because I think you'll find it's not. Let's go to 2 Samuel. Turn with me, if you will, to 2 Samuel chapter 11, or you can follow along in your insert there. It's a one-page insert, too long otherwise. And it says this in 2 Samuel chapter 11, beginning with verse 1. It says, "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Ramah. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, 'Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?' Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, 'I am pregnant.' So David sent this word to Joab, 'Send me Uriah the Hittite.' And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, 'Go down to your house and wash your feet.' So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants, and did not go down to his house. When David was told Uriah did not go home, he asked him, 'Haven't you just come from a distance? Why didn't you go home?' And Uriah said to David, 'The ark in Israel,'— that's the Ark of the Covenant, "the ark in Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my master Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open fields. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing.' Then David said to him, 'Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back.' So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, 'Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die.' So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, 'When you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, "Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerub-Besheth?'" Jerub-Besheth is another name for Gideon. "Didn't a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thisbeh? Why did you get so close to the wall? And if he asks you this, then say to him, 'Also your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead.'" The messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had told him to say. The messenger said to David, "The men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance to the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." David told the messenger, "Say this to Joab. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as the other. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab." When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David brought her home to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The thing David had done displeased the Lord. Now, if you're following in your Bibles, you may want to keep your finger right there, because we're soon going to go into chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. But for the time being, let's just pause right there and look at some of the things that are going on here. This is a poignant story, isn't it? Remarkable story. One evening, it says, David got up from his bed and went out on the roof of his palace. Doesn't say anything about Bathsheba being on the roof of her house, does it? That's a common misconception. I'm not being critical of this. This is just many people have it in their mind that, well, she was out on her house, on a rooftop also. She wasn't. She was taking a bath. She was bathing in the privacy of her own home. Now, many homes had courtyards in that day, and that's probably where she was, probably out in the courtyard, taking a bath. Nothing wrong with that. And it was in the evening, so they likely had torch lights around and things like that. And he could see her form and figure and all the rest. But she wasn't out sunning herself. She wasn't being seductive or tantalizing or anything like that, doing what should be done. Here's the four key parts of this passage, I think, in the early part. It says, he saw a woman. He saw Bathsheba down there bathing. And so he sent someone to find out about her. He sent, number two. And the fellow comes back and says, well, that's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And then he sent someone else to go pick her up, to bring her to him. Now, this is the king. Remember, this is King David, the most powerful king in all of Israel. And no doubt the most remarkable and the best king that Israel ever had. Powerful king. What's she going to say? No, I don't want to go. Can't do that. So she goes with those whom he had sent, his servants. And then the most damaging thing about all of this is the fact that he slept with her. He slept with her. That's adultery. That's adultery. She's married. And David likely was married. David had many wives. Doesn't matter. In those days, kings had many wives. That's just the way that goes. But nonetheless, she was married, and here's David sleeping with her. He learns that she is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Hittites were a culture that were up in Turkey, but they were friendly to the Israelites, and he just happened to be one of that culture. And he was serving in David's army. Don't get distracted by that. And so David, it says, brings him in and sort of wines and dines him. Well, let me see Uriah. This is after all this has occurred. And so they bring him Uriah. And David is a fellow well conversant with Uriah, or appears to be. Now think about it. Why would David call Uriah, this one individual out of his vast army? Why would he do that? Why? To kind of set him up. That's what I think. Set him up. Why? He doesn't know that he's attracted to his wife. Uriah doesn't. Has no idea. But that's what's going on. David is being immoral. He's being unethical. He's being a number of things here that we could name. It's the setup. And then he sends him, when he goes, says, go back home and so forth, and he sends a gift to him. Why would a king send a gift to one of his men and not all of his men? Why would he do that? Again, setting him up, in my mind. And he says, why didn't you go home last night, when he finds out that Uriah slept down at the entrance to the palace, David's palace? And he says, Uriah has a good answer for that. He says, you know, the Ark of the Covenant and Joab and Joab's men, your servants are all out in the field. I can't go home to a nice, comfortable setting and be with my wife when I think of them and think of the fact that they're out there suffering and struggling and things like that. He's an honorable man. Uriah is, obviously. Has character. Not good. Not good. Honorable, moral, ethical. Stay here one more day, David says. Stay here one more day and we'll make merry. We'll eat and drink and share some things and stories, whatever. And David gets him drunk. Why would David do that? Why? Again, part of the setup. Bosom buddies. We're good friends. I really like you, Uriah. I think you're a great man. Not good at all. And in the morning, this is where it really gets sticky, the scripture says. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab. And he gives that letter to Uriah. Here, take this to Joab, the commander. Now, of course, you know that Uriah is not going to open it. Why? You wouldn't dare open a letter from the king for fear of your life. In that letter, David writes, put Uriah right in the front line. Put him up where the most danger is, where he'll be exposed to the enemy, where there's slings and arrows and boulders and everything else can come at him. Set him up. That's the word. Uriah the Hittite. I want him dead. David doesn't say, but he wants his wife. That's the reason for it. So while the city was under siege, he put Uriah at a place, it says, where he knew the strongest defenders were. And of course, they come out and they engage in battle, and Uriah the Hittite is killed. We know the story there. Uriah the Hittite is dead. So Joab sends back a messenger to David. He says, go back and tell David all of these things. We had a pitched battle. We won, but Uriah the Hittite is dead. And he tells the messenger, David may question you about that. He may feign ignorance about a lot of things. But he says, if he does, just be sure to tell him that Uriah the Hittite is dead. Why did you get so close to the wall, is what David may ask. Didn't you know that was a bad thing to do? It's like he's trying to put the blame on Joab, which in fact he is. The blame for the murder of Uriah the Hittite. So now you see, David has engaged in two things, not only adultery, but in murder. Two of the 10 commandments that God gave. Two of the things, the strictest laws that God gave. Do not murder. Do not engage in adultery. He's guilty of those. So this is where we are. David sends back a letter to Joab after he finds that out. And he says, don't let this upset you. It happens. In battle, we know that things happen. People die. As if Joab didn't know that. Joab was the army's commander, had been for a long time, a very honorable man. David feigning innocence. That's all he's doing. Feigning innocence throughout this whole episode. And it says at the very end, when Uriah's wife heard that Uriah had died, she mourned for him. The period of mourning by the Mosaic law was 7 days. And once the 7 days were completed, she went to live with David. But now she's pregnant. She had sent back word to David after the initial time that he was with her. She said, I'm pregnant. David knew that. So now she comes to live with him. And what's going to happen next? We have a lot of things to see and do and hear about. If you will, turn with me. If you have your Bibles open, you can follow in the Pew Bible, or you don't need to, I'll just read it. This is 2 Samuel 12, verses 7 through 10. It says this. Then Nathan, you remember Nathan is David's very good friend, very close, intimate friend. Nathan said to David, you are the man. Oh my, condemning. You are the man. That's where this expression comes from that we know today. He's saying you are guilty, you are indicted, you are condemned of God. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says to David. I anointed you. king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all of this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. You despised me. You rejected me, is what he's saying. You disobeyed me. God is angry with David, and he should be, has every right to be, every reason to be. And then the punishment comes. David is going to be punished for this, and God is going to do that. And that account is just a few verses later, starting with verse 14. 2 Samuel 12, verse 14. He says this in the middle of verse 14. He says, because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. That son that you're about to have by Bathsheba, he's going to die. He's not going to make it. After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and went into his house and spent the nights lying on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused and would not eat food with them. You see, David is mourning because he knows this child is going to die. On the seventh day, the child died. David's servants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, we spoke to David, but he would not listen to us. How can we tell him that the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed that his servants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead, he asked. Yes, they said, he is dead. Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord. That's the tabernacle, because remember, the temple hasn't been built at this time. He went into the house of the Lord and worshiped. And then he went to his own house, and at his request, they served him food, and he ate. His servants asked him, why are you acting this way? Why, while the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat? Strange behavior. Why, David? Tell us why. And David answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and I wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. And that last sentence is very, very important. I will go to him, but he will not return to me. What that tells us is that in the time of David, and even before, they understood that there was a life after death. I will go to him. I'll see him in the next life. But he can't come back to me. It's just like today. The dead do not come back to us, but we can go to them, and we will go to them. That's significant, very significant. I will go to him, but he will not return to me. He's now mourning the loss of this son, this firstborn son that he's had with his wife, Bathsheba. James writes about this over 1,000 years later, well over 1,000 years later. He says this. He says, when tempted, you all know this verse, no one should say, God is tempting us or me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire, this is what happened to David, when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. And then after desire has conceived, he's not talking about David and Bathsheba conceiving, after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. That's what happens. That's what sin is. That's what sin is. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. But you see, it's like the music, the song that we sang this morning, the choir sang, I am redeemed. God knew that David was hurting. And David knew he had sinned. And he admitted that. He acknowledged that before God. And this is what God did for him. Found in 1 Kings. You don't need to turn, but 1 Kings 15. It says, for David's sake, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up a son to succeed him, and by making Jerusalem strong. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and not failed to keep any of the Lord's commandments all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. In the case of Uriah the Hittite, he's going to give him a son now. And this is what it says in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 22. It says, but you, this is God speaking to David now, you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest. And I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon. And I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name, the temple, the first temple. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and he will be my son, and I will be his father. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. This Solomon is going to be born to David and Bathsheba. Bathsheba. This woman who people condemn and think so poorly of and think she was wrong and bad and all the rest. What would you do? What would you do if you were a woman and the king calls and says, come over, come over? And even if you suspect he has some ulterior motive in mind, are you going to say, nope, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'm married. Bathsheba couldn't do that. David was all-powerful. He was the almighty king of Israel at that time. He was an amazing king, so many ways. We could go on all day talking about that. But you see, she sought forgiveness. David, sought forgiveness. I'm going to share that forgiveness that he sought next week with you. He wrote a psalm about it, beautiful psalm. But he's hurting. David is hurting. And this is what really happened. The fact that Bathsheba was an innocent victim in my mind. Innocent victim. Why do I say that? Think about today. Let me give you some names and you think about them. Matt Lauer. Think about that. Think about Harvey Weinstein. Bill Cosby. Do those resonate with you? Chances are they do. Same thing was going on then. The very same thing was going on in Israel at that time. It was a male-dominated society. And the males, I hate to say it, I'm sorry to say it, but they were in control. And women were chattel, if you want to use that term. Not good, not good at all. I want to explain that even better if I can, and you don't need to turn again, but you may if you wish. But Matthew, again, chapter 1, explains that, I think, so well. Now, bear in mind this. Matthew is a Jew, a Jewish tax collector, actually. The most depraved of all in the eyes of the Jews. But Matthew turns out to be a very good disciple, and he turns out to be one of the people that write one of the Gospels of Jesus Christ. But Matthew is going to defend manhood, the men. Why? Because that was the common practice in that day, just like it has been up until very recently and all throughout the world, in our nation especially. And if you will, let's just look at two verses. Chapter 1 of Matthew, verse 5, says this. It says, and this is the genealogy of Jesus Christ again. Remember that. It says Salmon, S-A-L-M-O-N. Salmon, the father of Boaz, we know Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Now, Rahab was a prostitute. Rahab had a business down in Jericho. That's who she was. She was a prostitute. Okay? Here's Rahab in here. And then Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. The Moabites were condemned by God. Why? They had not even fed the Israelites when they came up through the Sinai. They had not fed them. They picked this fellow, Balaam, his name was, to condemn and curse the Israelites. Why? They didn't want them coming through their territory. And it says that their daughters, the Moabite daughters, even seduced the Israelites and had them bow down to Baal, the idol. The Moabites were despicable in the eyes of God. But here's Ruth, a Moabite, and her name is right here, was Ruth, whose mother was Ruth. Obed then was the father of Jesse, it continues, and Jesse the father of King David. Now get this next one. David was the father of Solomon, we know that, we just read that, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. They don't even mention her. They don't name her. Bathsheba. Why not put Bathsheba? Bathsheba is part of the royal line. She is the head of the Davidic kingdom. Moreover, the mother of Solomon. And it's through her that this Davidic line will continue all the way down through the time of Jesus. So you see, I say again, I think she's got a bad rap. I'd like to clear her name. I'd like to do it right now today. I don't know if this will be nationally telecast or not, but in case, just let you know. But I just see her in a different light. Bathsheba. Someone to think about in a different way. I would invite anyone this morning who wishes to come and give your heart and soul and life to Jesus Christ. Anyone who wishes to rededicate, recommit your life. Anyone who wishes to come and pray at the altar, have a word with me, whatever it might be, we'll be standing and singing this wonderful hymn of invitation. Will you stand with me, please?